Well, a warm good morning to everyone and welcome to today's Asia Society event, Disruptive Asia, COVID and climate change, the need for a green recovery in Asia. My name's Rebecca Brown. I'm Senior Vice Provost and Vice Provost Research at Monash University. But just before we begin, we acknowledge that there are many participants in today's event, dialing in from many locations that have traditional owners and custodians. I'm currently sitting in the land of the Kulin Nations. I'd like to acknowledge all traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders or First Nation people joining our webcast today. At Monash, we're really delighted to be partnering with the Asia Society to deliver this event today, bringing Asia Society's Disruptive Asia publication to life and really focusing on how we can reconcile our need for recovery post-coronavirus with our vow to meet the 2030 sustainability agenda. At Monash, we like to think we're at the forefront of taking action on climate change. We're very proudly the first Australian university to commit to a very hard energy reductions target, laying the foundations for our net zero initiative to have net zero campuses by 2030. Sustainable development is also core to our research priorities and mission, and we activate that through many units, one being Monash Sustainable Development Institute, the Monash Energy Institute, and of course, ClimateWorks Australia. We're really committed to making an impact through our research in Asia. One particular program is our World Mosquito Program. The other is RISE, Revitalising Informal Settlements and Their Environments. And these programs are about uncovering the extent or the connectedness between environment and human health. And we have this implicit hypothesis that if you improve the quality of our environment, our physical environment, particularly in poor communities, you can help stop or slow the spread of disease. And understanding the connection between environment and communities is one of the ways that we can transform institutional and social structures, redress fundamental inequality and help build more resilient and sustainable places. So I really look forward to hearing from our guests more today on really how we can accelerate and progress in a post-COVID-19 world. Today we'll run for about 45 minutes, hopefully 25 minutes for a panel discussion and 15 minutes from you, our audience, of Q&A. So really please do think about your questions and submit them in the YouTube live chat box as we go. So it's my pleasure to introduce our expert panel for today. First of all, Meg Argyriou. Meg is Head of International Programs at ClimateWorks Australia. She focuses on Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and she designs and has led the organisation's new agenda setting program called Pathways to Prosperity. Meg writes frequently on the nexus between climate mitigation and sustainable development. Chi Manu is a partner at Deloitte, Australia's sustainability practice. He has over 18 years international experience in advising businesses and NGOs on sustainability issues and strategies, management systems, performance measurement, benchmarking, reporting and assurance, really key tools and strategies. And lastly, but not leastly, Patrick Suckling. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute. He formerly served as Australia's Ambassador for the Environment, Australia's High Commissioner to India, Ambassador to Bhutan, and headed the international area of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. So I think you'd all agree, a very compelling panel today. I'm really excited and looking forward to hearing from them. So now I'll hand over to Asia Society's Executive Director and Curator of this series, Thomas Soham. He will moderate this conversation. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Great to have you with us this morning, and thank you for those remarks. Thank you also for the collaboration with the Monash University on today's event. We are very proud to count you as one of our corporate members and partners, and I think it's very fitting collaboration today with your leadership on sustainability research and teaching, as you mentioned, both as an institution, but also want to say certainly in your own right as well, Rebecca. So thank you very much. I'd also like to acknowledge all traditional owners and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Patrick, Meg, and Chi, very good to see you all, and a very warm welcome. We'll go straight into our first question, and a question from Rebecca, our co-host, and one I think many of us will resonate with. Meg, I might put this to you. Obviously, COVID has had a huge impact on how people travel and how business operates, let alone the health implication in Australia and across the region. But how is this now affecting our carbon emissions? We know it's going down, and you could argue 2020 might even be a good year in that respect. But to what extent is it going down, and how likely is it to last as we return to some kind of normality? Meg.
Thanks, Thomas. Yes, emissions are going down in 2020 as a result of COVID, and the significant reduction in energy use is the thing that's driving it. So as you've mentioned, borders are closing, travel is significantly reduced, and that's having a huge impact on emissions from transport, particularly aviation. But in addition, with people staying home and isolated, and there is a reduction in trade flows as well. So overall, this is also reducing energy use in the manufacturing and production and transportation of goods and services, and products. So emissions have gone down quite significantly for 2020, and that is a really good thing for the climate. However, what we expect without significant intervention is that those emissions will rise very quickly once the crisis finishes. And we've already seen, in the case of China, who obviously sort of curtailed the spread of the virus very quickly and has been able to reopen its economy to some extent. And we're already seeing emissions rising quite quickly in China. So as the world begins to open up again, we can expect to see a significant ramping up of emissions again without significant intervention.
Thanks, Meg. And I'll come back to, we'll look at some specific cases in our region and the Pacific a bit later on in the conversation, and see how this is impacting them. Patrick, I might come to you now, and some initial reflections from you on COVID-19 and the impact it's having on the sustainability agenda more broadly. As huge amounts of money are being directed to the recovery efforts, and rightly so. The UN have made repeated calls for a COVID recovery that is green, clean and inclusive, and aligned with the Paris Agreement and the SDG commitments. You have also put forward a similar argument in your essay for Disruptive Asia, and also in your op-ed in Canberra Times yesterday. How are, as you see it, sustainability efforts impacted as Australia and the region is tackling the current pandemic, and what needs to happen as we reset and prepare for a post-COVID world? Patrick.
Well, thanks, Thomas, for that. I mean, clearly COVID is a major preoccupation. We see that on our news screens every night, and so you can project from that into what governments are dealing with around the region and the world. It's a major health and economic crisis, so it is taking focus away from other things. There are also the practicalities around COVID-19, and there's no better example on the sustainability climate front than the COP26 being pushed back till the end of next year. And this was really the year to start the Paris Agreement in earnest, and for countries to reaffirm their commitments, if not increase their commitments. And all of that has been postponed because of COVID-19. So definitely a preoccupation, taking focus away. There are also obvious risks in terms of the focus on sustainability efforts. They'll be different for different parts of the region. And you see how India is currently grappling with an enormous problem with infections out of control, the rising death rate, and really you can see the almost sole focus at the moment in terms of grappling with that. Whereas in Japan, by contrast, or Korea, there's it's almost business as usual in terms of how they've managed this pandemic so far, and in that sense the focus can be on sustainability more, and you're seeing that in announcements that are being made by them. I think it's also compounded by at times like this, anxiety levels rising, people being uncertain. The default in that case is often to stick with what you know, the status quo, whereas the sustainability agenda and the Paris Agreement is all about new realities, new worlds, forging a completely different future as outlined in the Paris Agreement, which is really a global transformation of every sector in the economy and communities. So clearly there are risks, and we've seen that in recent decisions by government, whether it's Australia, suggestions that we have a gas-led recovery, whether it's in the US, massive bailouts of the oil and gas industry, Korea bailing out coal companies, China funding new coal-fired power stations. So there is a risk in terms of that focus, not looking at what are the opportunities. But from the sense that I get, and as you said, from the thinking around the world now, there's also a major opportunity. In fact, it's an unprecedented opportunity because this is the worst economic crisis we've had since the global depression. In that context, trillions of dollars will be spent in economic recovery around the world, and including in our region. We're already seeing trillions of dollars announced across our region. And in that context, as I've written, as you've mentioned, there's a golden opportunity for a double dividend, where you can take an agenda to promote economic growth and jobs and mix it with climate action and get good outcomes that are mutually reinforcing in taking that approach. One is the unassailable logic of the Paris Agreement, which is that climate change is not going away. So unless we change our economic behavior, our economies will be impacted worse by climate change year on year, decade on decade. And so the imperative to change our economic systems is still as strong as it ever was. And therefore that should be a guide for the way in which recovery spending is spent around the region. But secondly, often recovery spending in sustainable areas can create more growth and jobs. And whether it's in infrastructure like energy or transport or agriculture, there's numerous studies now showing that investments in those areas, in clean, green, sustainable investments, can create more jobs and stronger growth, including through increased productivity. And you just have to look at the decline, the rapid decline in renewable energy, whether it's wind, solar, or batteries in the past few years, to see how that can inject significant productivity into different economies with new technologies, services, and ideas. So there is a golden opportunity for every economy in the world and each economy in our region to reap this double dividend. And you are seeing Korea's just made a major announcement on a Green New Deal. Japan is heading in that direction. China has a $500 million stimulus where they've said that they'll be focusing on new areas of the economy, including electric mobility and more sustainable agriculture. So in all sorts of different dimensions, there is a significant opportunity for a greener, stronger economic recovery.
Thank you, Patrick. A lot there, and we'll come back to some of those aspects a bit later on in the conversation. I wanted to bring Chi into the conversation and also get your perspective on some of the comments we've just heard, and particularly drawing on your expertise, Chi, advising corporate sector as well as government and NGOs on sustainability strategies and climate resilience. As many sectors and industries are obviously going through some very tough times, how is the pandemic now impacting corporate sustainability plans and targets? Are they being put to a side as some businesses are simply just trying to keep afloat, or have they become more important as they're trying to pivot to this new normal? Chi.
Thanks, Thomas. Look, I think we are still in the middle of the storm, if you like, and it's hard to say exactly what will happen. There are various scenarios out there about where corporate sustainability will go. But having said that, I think the fundamentals behind corporate sustainability are still in place. You have a growing investor base that is more energized than before in relation to climate action and investment in green technologies. You have a consumer and public that have not lost sight of the energy behind the global campaigns last year and the early parts of this year in relation to climate action. In fact, I know that there's been some global surveys done by Ipsos, etc., that back that up. The public are still keen on sustainability and climate action. But then if I think back as well to the chaos that's been created from COVID-19, in terms of disruptions to supply chains, in terms of straining of relationships between not just investors, but consumers, and the whole value chain impacting on businesses. I think that organizations are actually finding that their investments in sustainability are actually coming home to roost. In other words, that the disruption and the pain that's being experienced is aligning with the whole intent behind sustainability and purpose making for organizations. So, an organization that has a purpose that keeps its promises to communities and consumers is likely to have stronger relationships and more sticky relationships with consumers, more loyal consumers, and the same with investors. And I think in these hard times, businesses are finding that those investments that have been made prior to COVID are actually bearing fruit.
Thanks, Chi. I wanted to stay with you, just a follow-up question, and also drawing on your work. Obviously, risk and risk management is a very big part of this, as I guess companies are looking ahead and I guess trying to take lesson from the devastating experience we're now going through. So, how do we as businesses, governments, civil society organizations integrate these lessons, although, as you say, we're still in the middle of it, but how do we kind of bring them in, so to speak, into our risk matrix, and also the realization that we're going to be entering a very different world going forward? How can we plan for this?
I think Meg was talking about the impact on COVID on emissions, and there have been a lot of conversations about the parallels between the impact of COVID and climate, and the lessons learned from COVID in terms of what we should do to build a more resilient business model for the future, and also what we need to do in climate. So I think in terms of risk models, I like to go back to the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures recommendation on scenario planning. Now, organizations we know are not very comfortable or familiar with the use of scenario planning in strategy and risk management. And going forward, given what we have experienced with the disruptions and uncertainty with COVID, there is an urgent need, I think, for organizations to start practicing and embedding scenario analysis and scenario planning into risk management as well as strategy. So that's the first point. The other point that I want to say is that traditionally we look at risk management for organizations. It's very operational and it's very kind of linear. And yet we are in a situation here with COVID that is very similar to what's happening with climate, in that we are hostages in a system with lots of dependencies and uncertainties upstream and downstream of us. How do we convert that kind of castle mentality of defense in the traditional risk management approach to one that is far more collaborative and supportive of the broader network that we operate within, so that we can help others like vulnerable suppliers and treat that as a mitigation solution, and use that as a way to inform our own resilience within our fence line. So that's a mindset shift, I think, that needs to take place within risk management.
Thanks, Chi. I think there's some very good advice there. We're going to go now more back to the region and looking at green recovery there, and coming back to you, Patrick. our ability to meet the SDG targets globally and reduce greenhouse gas emissions depends significantly on what the regions and arguably the two of the world's biggest emitters, China and India, will actually do. And while they have made pledges to cut their emissions, and we see some positive signs as a result of COVID, as the countries recover from the pandemic, will they be able to and willing to commit to those earlier pledges of cutting emissions? What's the path looking ahead as you see it with regards to China and India, Patrick?
The path ahead, it is what I was saying earlier. I mean, it's the logic of the Paris Agreement, and that still holds. So, you know, if we don't transform the global economy to low emissions, more climate resilient economies, then we'll all be worse off. My sense is China and India get that. The Paris Agreement says the world gets that. I mean, don't forget the Paris Agreement came into force in record time and has been ratified in record time by an enormous number of countries. So. And critical to that have been China and India. And, you know, it's often said that China and India haven't made significant commitments under the Paris Agreement, which is really not correct. If you look at China's commitments, it's a 60 to 65% reduction in emissions intensity per unit of GDP by 2030 and to peak emissions by 2030. And they're taking significant actions across a spectrum of sectors, particularly the energy sector, but also in agriculture and transport to see those improvements happen. You know, developing countries under the Paris Agreement were given more flexibility because of their status in terms of where they are developing. And so in that sense, and in India as well, their contribution, their commitment to 33 to 35% reduction of emissions intensity. And India has a target of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy, or 40% by 2030 of its economy, which for a developing economy in India's position is extraordinary. And they're on track to meet that target. So, but yes, you're right. The major point is that China and India alone could break the Paris Agreement, and therefore the logic of a green recovery really does need to continue to be reinforced and to strengthen in both those economies, but around the world. And the logic is very powerful, as I was mentioning. One, because unless we head towards the Paris Agreement goals, we're all going to be worse off, and therefore there's an economic imperative of China and India to make sure that they play their part so that they're not worse off. India and China are among the more vulnerable countries in the world. The World Bank did a study on India that shows it's possibly the most vulnerable country in some dimensions to climate change, but also these new technologies and the opportunities for more growth, stronger growth, better growth, more sustainable growth, and more jobs are there. China's leading the world on renewable energy, on whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's batteries, whether now it's electric vehicles. There are whole new industries being created, and so I'm positive that, notwithstanding the risks, and there definitely are risks, that the economics itself will impel China and India towards cleaner, greener futures. Someone was telling me, someone out of the Energy Research Institute of India the other day, that there are all these coal-fired power stations planned on the drawing board for India, but most of them will never actually be built on their analysis, purely because at the moment there's oversupply in the Indian electricity sector. So banks aren't lending for the funding of new coal-fired power stations. And by the time that excess capacity is worked through the system by 22-23 in India, already per unit, solar and other renewable energy costs in India are cheaper, the cheapest new build of power. And therefore by 2022-23, on this analysis, banks won't lend for new coal-fired power then, even less. And so you won't see those power stations get built. You'll see more and more renewable energy coming on into India. And so I haven't seen either China. In fact, China said that they will look at increasing their target in the context of COP26. And I haven't seen anything to say that they're going to walk back from their commitments. In fact, they're saying the opposite. And India at the moment is ahead of its commitments. It's looking to overachieve on its current target. So in that sense, there are all sorts of positive signs. But as I was saying at the beginning, there is a risk of slipping back into the status quo, and some of their stimulus spending is concerning in that context, especially China with new coal-fired power stations being approved, which is counter to the trend that was going on in China over the last few years. But then they have said and emphasised in their new package of spending commitments that they will have a focus on clean and green. And similarly, they're saying that their One Belt, One Road initiative, which is currently fueling a whole lot of coal-fired power across the world, particularly in our region, they're going to take a look at greening that quite significantly. So I think the direction of travel is encouraging, but it does need continued momentum and continued advocacy and a continued global effort to make sure that we head in the right direction and not the wrong direction.
Thanks, Patrick. I think there will be interest to follow those trends between now and the rescheduled COP26 next year. Meg, I want to come back to you now and I guess drawing on some of your work, but looking at another part of Asia and Southeast Asia and the prospect for a green recovery there. Obviously, again, COVID hit them very hard, including major economies and countries with vast population like Indonesia and big economies like Singapore. What, in your view, what does a green recovery look like for them, and what are some of the unique challenges they face in order to make that a reality? Meg.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, so green recovery focuses on investing in clean infrastructure and clean energy infrastructure, clean transport, such as public transport and so on, and prioritising industrial growth in areas that provide lower emissions. So the potential for that is really good across Southeast Asia. So I think in the first tranche of COVID response, what we see is countries supporting their healthcare systems, providing a social safety net, and providing some support to businesses so that they sort of can weather the storm to some extent. But what we can expect to see in the next tranche of stimulus funding is a significant focus on large-scale job creation and infrastructure investment. And the needs for infrastructure across Southeast Asia remain really high, so that makes sense as a focus area. And what we need to do is ensure that that is as green as possible. So there are, some early signals, I think. The region overall is still coping with the pandemic, but certainly in our discussions in Indonesia, we've seen that there's an appetite for focusing on green recovery, which is really promising. Overall, I think the region is really well placed to benefit from a focus on green recovery. And this is what our sort of research showed last year, where we looked at opportunities for comparative advantage across ASEAN countries, in particular Indonesia, Vietnam and the Philippines. And what we found is that each of those countries has clear strengths in relation to low carbon technologies that, if they focus on prioritising through policy and investment support, can be the sort of, the new economic drivers for those economies. So this includes clean energy technologies such as solar panel production, wind tower production, battery storage, and so on, as well as sort of clean transportation and so on. And so the focus needs to be on investing in sort of supporting those kind of sectors going forward to encourage a green recovery. But I think, the opportunity becomes really interesting when you think about this not at an individual country level, but at a regional level. So if you think about the opportunities for regional trade across ASEAN and the ability to build and strengthen supply chains to meet that regional demand for low carbon technologies that we're already seeing illustrated in countries' nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. All of the countries in ASEAN have made commitments to reduce emissions, and that requires investment in infrastructure that is low carbon. So by sort of mapping that supply and demand across the region, there's the opportunity to really fast track that pivot towards green growth in the region, which I think is really exciting. But that does, it does require a shift in policy direction, and we really need to see that happen quite quickly, given the scale of investment that we can expect to see as part of the COVID recovery response. So as Patrick touched on, it really is an unprecedented amount of investment that we can expect to see in coming years. And this really will make or break, our efforts to pivot towards achievement of the Paris Agreement. We're quite literally at a fork in the road in relation to that. But I think, across Southeast Asia, the climate imperative remains really strong. The region is highly affected by the impacts of climate change. And it's also one of the regions with the fastest growing emissions in the world. So, sort of that pivot is really critical there. But it's also important, I think, to think about the recovery from a broader perspective. So green recovery absolutely matters for the region, but the region is also continuing to face quite complex social challenges that have been exacerbated by COVID. And just as one example, the estimation of people in Indonesia who will fall back below the poverty line as a result of COVID, range from between 1.5 million people up to 19.5 million people. So a huge impact on the sort of development advances that the country has made over recent years. But I think the point is, and Patrick touched on this as well, that there are a lot of co-benefits from focusing on a green recovery that can really help to address both of these in parallel. Green industries often create more jobs. They're better quality jobs typically. And there's a whole lot of stuff that can be done as part of sort of an immediate economic recovery response that can provide jobs for low-skilled workers. And of course, across the region, we have a large proportion of informal work as well. So the sorts of things that can be done are things like sort of basic energy efficiency measures. And we saw this in Australia post GFC, where we invested quite a lot of money in changing everyone's light bulbs. That created thousands of jobs overnight, and quite low-skilled jobs. So similarly, there's a significant need for restoring degraded landscapes across the Southeast Asian region. This sort of tree planting provides a whole lot of benefits in terms of climate resilience, creates low-skilled jobs, and so on. But the recovery, firstly can deliver some social benefits through the types of jobs that are created and the focus on green recovery overall. But I think it's also critically important to keep in mind that the region will choose to, and quite rightly, will choose to focus on strengthening some of that social resilience as well as a result of COVID. So enhancing healthcare systems, strengthening education outcomes are some of the areas that are really good to focus on in relation to that, as well as things like access to energy, clean water and sanitation. So I think overall a package that sort of focuses on that economic resilience aspect, that thinks about both the risks from climate change as well as the risks to development in the face of these kind of crises is really important. Thanks.
That's great, Meg. And we're shortly going to go to audience questions, and please have your questions ready. Well, Meg, I just wanted to have a quick follow-up. We can't forget our Pacific neighbours who obviously have been hit very hard. They're obviously already severely impacted by climate change, and now with COVID, and obviously economically, they've had to close their borders to tourists, tourism being one of their major source, if not the major source of income for most of the Pacific nations. So despite their success in holding the virus at bay, these countries are obviously among the hardest hit economically. So what's the outlook for the Pacific region, obviously noting there's 22 island states and very localized issues, but if you can just give some kind of broader observations there.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So the Pacific Island countries have been extremely hard hit as a result of the basically shutting down of the tourism industry. That is a huge economic driver for them. So we can expect to see that those economies across the Pacific will contract, and that of course will have consequences for poverty and for welfare across the region. And it will also, no doubt, increase the levels of indebtedness across the region as well. Pacific Island countries are typically quite aid dependent. So they will require a lot of support in their recovery effort from multilateral banks and bilateral donor governments such as the Australian government in order to help to stimulate that economy. But I think, there is already, sort of a sense that COVID is providing an opportunity to plan for healthier and more resilient economies. And countries are seeing this as an opportune time to emphasise risk-informed and risk-considered development planning, which is a really positive thing. And this will focus on their health systems and facilities that can help to strengthen their resilience against events such as COVID and, of course, against climate change as well. I think one of the really interesting and important things to note is, that despite these huge impacts on the region, we're not seeing any, desire to reduce climate ambition in the region. And you might know that, Pacific Island countries firstly are, at the front line of the impacts of climate change, but they are also, some of the leading governments to have committed to very ambitious climate targets. And we're not seeing any shift at all in that work. So we already have net zero emissions targets that have been set by the Marshall Islands, the government of the Marshall Islands, the government of Fiji, and we're currently working with the government of Tonga on a similar project. And I think, one of the benefits, in addition to sort of enhancing their resilience and doing their part in relation to climate change, but it's also worth flagging the economic resilience benefits that come for Pacific Islands in particularly reducing fossil fuel use. So a huge proportion of GDP is spent on transport fuels in the Pacific. They're heavily dependent in particular on shipping, but also aviation. And all of that is imported. So that's a huge burden on their economies. So any efforts, as well as importing, some fossil fuels for electricity generation as well. So any efforts that they can make to reduce that reliance on imported fossil fuels actually also provides an economic resilience benefit as well. So COVID, I think, is creating a context where that becomes even more acutely a need in order to provide that sort of economic resilience outcome over time.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Megan. Good summary there. I want to also look at, with the panel, obviously, the opportunities. We talk about, obviously, a green and clean recovery, but, some of the opportunities that presents itself for business and for corporates as well as governments to, I guess, leverage this situation for a positive outcome. And I might take this actually to Patrick. Obviously, with your current work now and drawing on your vast experience with climate change, how do you see Australia benefiting from a green recovery in Asia? What are some of the opportunities you see there that Australian governments and Australian businesses can really take advantage of? Patrick.
Well, thank you for that question, and thanks for focusing on business, because Chi, I think, made very good points around how in so many ways governments are driving this agenda, but in increasing ways business is driving this agenda because they're seeing the bottom line for them, and it's the same sort of logic. They're seeing that they need to be climate smart in their investments because that's where the growth is going to be. So if you see BlackRock recently announced that pretty much their entire $7 trillion portfolio is going to shift to a sustainability focus because the returns on the hard maths, the hard numbers are better. And so what you are seeing is business stepping up as core business in terms of their business strategy, saying there are enormous opportunities, not only just risks in terms of what she was talking about, but significant opportunities for investments. For Australia, again, we're in pole position as we have often been in terms of taking advantage of these opportunities. For example, if you look at the renewable energy sector, the IPCC estimates that it's a $1.6 to $3.8 trillion investment every year till 2050, just in that one sector. And because the Asian region will continue to remain the world's most dynamic and fastest growing region economically, and decade on decade that's expected to continue just in that one sector for Australian capabilities. And we have many capabilities, whether it's in solar, renewable, hydro. We're looking at hydrogen as a whole national strategy on hydrogen. That's going to be a massive opportunity for Australia, potentially as big as our LNG gas exports currently are. Just that one sector alone tells you the size of the business opportunities. And then there's all the software and the digital platforms that will be built around grid transition technologies and off-grid solutions, with linking rooftop solar with smart meters and batteries in cars and creating virtual power stations. There's a whole revolution coming in the energy sector across our region. But that's just one sector. If you look at infrastructure, it's exactly the same. We need climate smart and resilient infrastructure. Buildings, for example, lower emissions buildings with all sorts of energy efficiencies in that, and that gets to a whole digital world as well, where there are advances happening in Australia on that spectrum. Agriculture, you know, so much of the Indo-Pacific is communities still depend predominantly on agriculture, and there's another revolution coming in agriculture around precision agriculture, ag tech, but also much more sustainable farming practices. We're seeing that happening in Australia, and the Emissions Reduction Fund, or the Climate Solutions Fund, is buying abatement out of the Australian land sector in a way that's seeing a whole lot of innovation and new technologies coming, which we can then apply not only in Australia, but can export as well. So and transport's a whole other sector. So, you know, from an Australian perspective, first of all, there are enormous opportunities within Australia, and the firm that I'm working at now, that I'm a partner of, Pollination, is seeing an amazing amount of interest in this new economy, this transition economy world, because all sorts of businesses are now saying, look, you know, we can't stand still. As the ex-governor of the Bank of England said, companies that don't adjust to this changing world, that don't transition to manage and mitigate the risks of climate change and take advantage of the opportunities, will simply fail to exist into the future. We're seeing that at Pollination. There's an extraordinary amount of corporates coming to us now seeking advice, not only in terms of how they manage their risks, but the sorts of investment opportunities that they take in the different sectors that I've mentioned. So something to be really optimistic about, not only for Australia, but for every country in the region.
I think that's right. Thank you very much, Patrick. I want to now take the first audience question, and it's, you know, we just discussed the role of business and corporate sector. This question comes back to, again, the role of government and the Australian government, and maybe I can give this question to Meg or Rebecca. I know obviously Monash and ClimateWorks have been looking at this as well, but what is the likely interest and investment in sustainable finance from the Australian government? What's the outlook there? Obviously, the opposition has made their own comments there, but what is your view and what might need to happen again as Australia as an economy, as a government, pivot from this pandemic? So the question is really around sustainable spending and investment from the current Australian government. Meg or Rebecca, if you want to, if you have any comments on that.
I'm happy for you to respond, Rebecca, if you feel comfortable doing so.
Yeah, I actually think that perhaps some of our colleagues, particularly from a sustainable finance perspective here, might actually have something more informed to say than myself, specifically in the Australian financial investment. Thomas?
Sure. Well, maybe I come back to, maybe I bring it to Chi as well. We just heard from Patrick, but maybe Chi, you have some, obviously what are, more on the Australian government side, and I guess the role of government in supporting sustainable initiatives.
So let me maybe give a business perspective on that, which is that we've all heard it many times from many sectors, that business need clear policies, signals from governments in relation to the energy transition, in relation to carbon targets, etc. And they need that because businesses need to make long-term capex decision-making, investment decision-making, and to have we talked about investors providing those strong signals, sustainable finance, BlackRock, etc., about what the future expectations are of businesses in terms of where they should be driving growth in relation to how that growth impacts on sustainable development goals and also the Paris Agreement. But we also need the clarity in relation to public policy as well. And if we had both, it would be fabulous.
I think, yeah, there's some work to be done there. I think, but it's I think, you know, as a community, we can raise those concerns collectively. And I want to bring Meg back in as well, and just to follow up to that question, but also add another one, bringing back your comments on the Pacific, but again, the role of the Australian government, obviously providing a lot of aid and development assistance to the Pacific. How much of that is, you know, really dealing with the climate challenges we see there? Obviously, we have a Pacific Step Up. They also recently released a new, Pacific Recovery Plan. What's the role of climate change and climate, I guess, mitigation or adaptation in those policy frameworks?
Thank you. So I was just going to add, in relation to the role of government, that there is actually a global initiative called the Greening the Financial System Initiative. I think that's the name of it. But it's a program that's being developed by a number of central banks who've agreed to develop some common scenarios that can then guide the way that they are instructing financial institutions in their countries to do scenario-based risk analysis. And this is actually a really important step forward. And I should say Australia is a member of that group. And this is a really important step forward because at the moment, risk assessment is done on a company by company basis. They choose how to design those risk assessments. And what this does is provides a common framework that companies will be required to respond to. And that allows a much better, firstly, much greater transparency and much better comparability across the performance of different companies. So I think that's the sort of role that government needs to play in relation to sort of greening financial systems. On the second question, in relation to the Pacific Island countries, so Patrick can definitely respond very well to this. But I think, most of the focus of government support for the Pacific at the moment is focused on adaptation and resilience. So there's and infrastructure support as well. And I think Pacific Island countries would argue that actually what they really need Australia to be doing is to be reducing its own emissions and stepping up in relation to sort of its role as a leader in addressing climate change, because many Pacific Island countries will be hugely impacted. Some will actually go, completely disappear if we don't act strongly on climate change. Even under a 1.5 degree scenario, the impacts across the region are very, very significant. So as a close regional neighbour and a friend of the Pacific, I think that what the Pacific Island countries would be asking is for stronger action on our own doorstep in relation to climate change mitigation.
Yeah, I think that's right. Thanks, Meg. Rebecca, did you have something to comment on there as well, please?
Oh, yeah, just broadly, if we look at a lot of our development aid from Australia, New Zealand, and other countries, as well as in the region, particularly the Pacific, but also in the ASEAN countries, a lot of the actual execution of that aid is typically traditional business as usual infrastructure, even if it's got the policy rhetoric around clean infrastructure. There is a major need to transform the execution of those agreements, what we're measuring as successful delivery, because this type of infrastructure sets up emissions, environmental, human, financial relationships for 50 to 100 years. And we're not seeing that follow through in the big transactions of these grants that then shape in-country government expectations and then drives what businesses deliver in their supply chain. So that middle run of processes, there's a lot of work to be done there and significant opportunity.
I want to bring Chi and maybe Patrick in here as well before we unfortunately have to conclude. But there's obviously a question here around collaboration between private and public sector. Maybe you'd share your perspective there, Chi. What do you see needs to happen here?
Well, I think, if we go back to the UN's assessment of the trillions of funding gap to actually meet the goals of the SDGs, there is an acknowledgement that the private sector needs to come to the table. So public sector funding is not in itself sufficient. That's the first point. Secondly, in the absence of public recovery packages, we already know that sustainable finance, the world of green financing, is ballooning, and it's being driven by the interest in investors, right? And that thirdly, there are increasingly exciting examples of structures being put in place that bring the private sector, foundations, development banks, and the public sector together on achieving and dealing with common objectives. And to Rebecca's point about measurement, it is all about trying to create the structures in place that drive outcomes in the short, medium, and long term that connect to SDGs, that are relevant to the goals of investors who are then really keen to invest.
I'll bring this follow on from that, and I'll bring Patrick back in just to add to the private public sector collaboration, but also on a more international global scale. In terms of what we're seeing now in the international response to COVID. What can we take from that in terms of how governments and private sector and also community groups are working together? How can we leverage and learn from that to kind of rally around the work that really needs to happen to achieve the climate targets and the SDG commitments?
Thanks, Thomas. And just building on what Chi was saying, I mean, again, in pollination, this climate advisory and investment business that I'm involved with at the moment, we're seeing that there is that almost inevitable link between government and the private sector, because if you're forging a new future, it does have to be a collective effort, and governments do have to set the policy, the enabling environment to make stuff happen. But actually, they also, in many instances, have to facilitate new births, shall we say. And a really good example in Australia of that is the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. So ARENA is funded to commercialise and scale up new technologies. Been doing a terrific job in doing that, because so many new technologies die, the valley of death, as they call it, where they just can't get private sector capital. And then what the Clean Energy Finance Corporation is doing is it's with some government money, then mobilising private sector money into clean energy investments. And, with a balance sheet of $10 billion, I think they've only ever committed about $6 billion of that so far. And they've mobilised $25 billion worth of clean energy investments across the Australian economy. That's a fantastic example of the private sector and the public sector in a financial sense, working together for accelerating transition. And the UK did that first with the Green Bank, and then it did so well that they sold it, and the Macquarie Bank bought the Green Bank, and now Macquarie Bank's building a massive green finance capability, not only in Australia but internationally. And again, a perfect example, I think, of the way in which governments and the private sector can work together. I mean, extrapolating that to the global stage, yes, there does need to still be a very significant all-in effort from everybody. And I think we saw that all last year before COVID came and hit us all. You were seeing communities, whether it was the emergency strikes, the children, one very important thing to note about this whole green recovery is we were seeing our children angry and anxious, protesting, striking last year. The trillions of dollars that we'll spend in economic recovery around the world will be debt. And our kids and our grandkids are going to have to pay for that. So we really can't lumber them with dead ends of high emissions and worse economic outcomes. And so on an international scale, there is definitely a need for leadership at a government level, definitely a need for leadership at the business level. I mean, climate change, like COVID, is a global problem that requires a global solution. No one country can solve this. It will literally take the whole world acting. And therefore, that's why COP26 next year is so important, because hopefully we will move away from this preoccupation from COVID. We will move into economic recovery. We will see a stronger momentum for green recovery, but that will need to be coordinated. I mean, we're in a different world. We're not seeing the sort of coordinated response to COVID that we saw in the global financial crisis coming out of the G20, let alone recovery stimulus being coordinated as we saw out of the G20. You know, we're in a different geostrategic world at the moment, as we see on the news, and the relations with the US and China are particularly important in that respect. But in terms of making real progress globally on this, it does have to be a collective effort, and there will be a moment into next year to, as more and more governments start focusing on less on triage and crisis management and more on recovery, hopefully, touch wood, that there will be that opportunity for the sort of cooperation and coordination that saw the historic Paris Agreement, and that should see the world rallying around the strongest possible coordinated recovery with spillovers to economies, because it is coordinated, as happened with the global financial crisis. And at the heart of that is the green recovery narrative. And I'm sure that will get stronger and stronger, particularly if there's a change of administration out of the US next year. I mean, Biden's announced an extraordinarily ambitious climate agenda, which will dovetail with the UK's ambitious climate agenda for COP26 in any case, and the global climate agenda through the start of the Paris Agreement, in terms of countries reaffirming their NDCs and hopefully strengthening them. And so, yes, that will all come together only if governments, business, communities, everybody pull together in the same direction. And the encouraging signs that you get, even with all the distractions of COVID, is that climate's not going away from people's consciousness. And just looking at the amount of announcements that businesses are making over the last few months in terms of net zero commitments, even in Australia, there's been a rash of them, but around the world, there's been an avalanche. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. There's a great sense of hope, I think, that the economics, the politics, and communities are working together on climate action for a stronger, more sustainable recovery.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And I think that's a perfect way to finish the discussion this morning. We over time, well and truly, but it was some really fascinating insights and a very rich discussion. So thank you very much again for taking the time and to share your expertise and insights and perspectives. Also, a big thank you to Professor Rebecca Brown at Monash University. We couldn't have asked for a better co-host and partner, and of course also to our viewers and listeners for joining us today. If you want to go deeper on some of these topics, do head to our website, where you can find all the essays in the Sustainability Special Edition of Disruptive Asia. Our next Disruptive Asia discussion is on the 27th of August. And we will actually draw out some of the points made today and move to the social pillar of sustainable development and discuss inclusive growth, community resilience, and the social impacts of COVID in Asia. And joining me will be experts from the University of Sydney and the Asian Development Bank, with further speakers to be announced. So please look out for that. Until then, stay well and keep safe. Bye for now.